we imagined this at QMUL when we planned this seminar, and you were going to be in our wonderful octagon space there, and Parvati was going to be standing in front of you and welcoming everyone to QMUL. Not to be, but it's still a great pleasure to have you with us, Parvati. Parvati is Professor of Hispanic, Cultural and Migration Studies and Head of the School of Languages, Linguistics and Film at Queen Mary University of London. Parvati.
Thank you so much, Paul, and thank you for having me here at this very exciting and important event. And like Paul, I say, I too am sorry that we're not able to welcome you physically and in person in our much loved campus and in the splendid octagon, but we hope that may be possible in the near future. But we also hope that this digital means actually means also that, you know, we do come together on shared ideas and thoughts. Come what may, physically, virtually, but at least we do have this wonderful technology that makes this connection possible. So thank you. And I just wanted to say that I'm also on the leadership team of the Global Policy Institute, which is of course led by our VP International, who has very warm connections with Brazil, and is together with myself and many others, a great admirer also of the wonderful innovative work that Professor Paul Heritage has been doing for so long in so many areas of with the People's Palace projects. And as a member of GPI, I want to express firstly, not just our admiration, but also our absolute delight and pleasure in working with People's Palace projects and with Professor Heritage in terms of so many synergies that we have been discussing, and we've had the, you know, the wonderful experience of learning as well from the projects that are underway, and this is one more amongst them. And coming from my school, from the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at Queen Mary, I can say to you that one of the sort of concerted conversations that are occurring with students at undergraduate and postgraduate levels, with staff, with our colleagues across the different schools of our faculty, is the question of decolonizing the curriculum and trying to understand what that means and how we can do it. I could not personally think of a better way to think about decolonization than through thinking about our methods as teachers, as researchers, as practitioners. And particularly, I think the question of methodologies that you will be considering at today's webinar on Indigenous research is probably going to be something that a lot of us at Queen Mary will be able to learn from. So thank you for having me here, and I wish you all a very productive and enjoyable discussion and conversation. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Parvati. And I've just seen that Stanley's entered the waiting room and has just joined us. That's really important because he's part of our first panel. I'm now going to invite Ian Stanton, who's Head of International Development and Area Studies at the AHRC, to say his words of welcome. But I would like personally, and thank you for being here today. Those of us that have been lucky enough to be on this journey for the last 2 or 3 years will know how important it has been, the commitment, personal commitment, I think in many respects, as well as institutional commitment of the ESRC and of the AHRC to carving out this space and time and obviously resource for us to think together and share our work. And Ian, we know it's often not been easy along these 3 years, and probably this is one of the most difficult moments. So thank you very much for coming to speak to us today. Ian.
Thanks, Paul. So yes, I'm Ian Stanton. I head up the International Development and Area Studies team within AHRC as part of UKRI. And so I suppose the first thing I'd like to say is actually thank you to Paul and his team for putting this together. The stuff we're going to be discussing today is really important. And each of the sessions we've done over the last few years, we as UKRI have learned a bit more about how we can work with the researchers that we fund. And that's something we're committed to carry on doing, because it is really important. I recognise that right now it is really hard. I know that there have been communications that have gone out to researchers and institutions even yesterday, and that there's a lot of anxiety in the community. There's not much I can say. I know you will have questions. we're not in a position to answer them, unfortunately. I know that's not a helpful response, but that's where we are, sadly. UKRI will be providing more information as we go through. I guess what I want to say is that I wouldn't want the current situation to derail some of the conversations that we are due to have today. There are mechanisms to ask queries, and I can provide you with the links for those if that's helpful. And I'm not saying that we should completely divorce our discussions from the current situation, but I think it'd be really helpful if we could try and focus on what these discussions are supposed to be about. But I appreciate that's very easy for me to say. So yeah, let me add my welcome. And if you do have questions, then I can try and provide some of the routes to get those answers. But yes, I'm looking forward to the discussions.
Thank you, Ian. So just before I hand over to Claudia via video, I just want to say, just to remind, some of us haven't been on the journey the whole way through. So this is an initiative that started in 2018, which was led by the AHRC and the ESRC, to think about the portfolio of projects that had sort of almost casually started around Indigenous. And at the beginning, it was very much around Indigenous research methods, whether the research councils should think about methodological questions that are specific to working in partnership with Indigenous researchers. And that has developed into a series of case studies which are available, and Thiago can share the site if for those members who haven't been participating from the beginning. 12 case studies, I think it was, which were written between Indigenous researchers and non-Indigenous researchers. There was then a meeting in Rio de Janeiro in March 2019, where those people who've written those case studies met together. That was hosted by Takuman Kwikuru from the Kwikuru people in the Xingu territories in Brazil at the Museum of Indigenous Peoples in Rio de Janeiro with People's Purpose Projects. And then we hosted another meeting, which, goodness, was that May last year in 2020. And thinking, really, it's an evolving process of thinking, where do we want to go? How much do these connections between us, are they important? They're difficult. We're working in really different contexts. Are there actually connections that we want to pursue, methodological, political, ethical? What do we want to ask of the UKRI, not just in terms of finance, but about, are there guidelines, are there processes that need to be in place? All these things have been part of our discussions. When we met in Rio, we had a number of Indigenous people, participants from Brazil itself, in addition to the Indigenous participants that came from 8 different countries, and I think 11 or 12 researchers from UK. We could have we did invite Takuman to come again, but we thought it would be good to invite somebody else who was very much a part of our process in Rio. And so this time we invited Claudia Maigora from the Mbara Chami people in Colombia. Unfortunately, because of timings and internet connections, and I suppose a certain nervousness, we decided that it'd be easier for Claudia to produce a short video rather than to welcome us live on Zoom. So, Thiago, would you like to just to share the ritual that Claudia has prepared for us?
En el seminario que están haciendo, la palabra de las movilizaciones de la Guardia Indígena. Esta canción significa que las guardias debemos luchar por nuestra tierra, por nuestra cultura, y que los ancestros nos dejaron, que nosotros nunca debemos de abandonar la danza y la cultura. Y esta es la cultura de la comunidad indígena de las colonias. Guardia, guardia, fuerza, fuerza, por mi raza, por mi tierra. Guardia, guardia, fuerza, fuerza, por mi raza, por mi tierra. Guardia, guardia, fuerza, fuerza, por mi raza, por mi tierra.
que con valentía y fuerza en sus corazones, indios que con valentía y fuerza en sus corazones, por justicia y pervivencia, hoy empuñan los bastones, por justicia y pervivencia, hoy empuñan los bastones. Son amigos de la paz, van de frente con valor, son amigos de la paz, van de frente con valor y levantan los bastones con orgullo y sin temor, y levantan los bastones con orgullo y sin temor. Va adelante compañeros, dispuestos a resistir, va adelante compañeros, dispuestos a resistir, defender nuestros derechos, así nos toque morir, defender nuestros derechos, así nos toque morir. Guardia, guardia, fuerza, fuerza, por mi raza, por mi tierra, guardia, guardia, fuerza, fuerza, por mi raza, por mi tierra. Compañeros han caído, pero no nos vencerán. Compañeros han caído, pero no nos vencerán. Porque por cada indio muerto, otros miles nacerán. Porque por cada indio muerto, otros miles nacerán. Dolores y paeses, llanaconas y guambianos, dolores y paeses, llanaconas y guambianos, con colucos y apidaras, todos los indios colombianos, con colucos y apidaras, todos los indios colombianos.
Muchísimas gracias. Eso se trató de la Guardia Indígena, español para todos aquellos que entienden español. Muchísimas gracias y que tengan muy buen día.
Thank you to Claudia and for everyone who's made that possible. I wish I could have that ritual at the beginning of every one of my days at the moment. They feel like words that we all need to be hearing, my goodness. It gives me enormous pleasure now and a natural link to ask Dr. Teresa Armijos Burneo. My mixture of Portuguese and Spanish doesn't get any better, Teresa. I'm really sorry. Lecturer in Natural Resources and International Development at the University of East Anglia, and who's going to be chairing our first panel. Thank you so much, Teresa.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, everyone. It's so good to be here. And yes, we're not together like we were in Rio 2 years ago, but it's fantastic to see some familiar faces again and to meet others that we were not able to meet there or have joined this important journey, as Ian was saying, through these past 2 years. And yes, Ian, it is very difficult. We got those letters, but this is an important moment because we need to be positive. We need to look forward and think about what Claudia was saying about this idea of resisting and continuing doing what we do and for the reasons that we do that are, of course, have to do with decolonial ways of moving on and thinking about knowledge in different forms. I also wanted to highlight again this issue or the amazing moment that we are going through in terms of Indigenous presence in Latin America, because the next panel, the one that we're working now on, it's about what are the different challenges for Indigenous research in the region. And I wanted to highlight something that happened in Ecuador. By the way, I'm in Ecuador, and apologies, there might be some birds or animals. I'm in the countryside at the moment that might join us. For the first time in the elections in Ecuador that they happened a month ago, the Indigenous candidate got around 17% of the total votes. He almost made it to the second round of the elections. And that is an important moment because it shows that more people that are not necessarily Indigenous were willing to vote for him, not only as an Indigenous person, but as a project. And that is the point that I wanted to make here. It's a project that the Indigenous peoples of Ecuador and Latin America, because they are very linked, are proposing. I think that is also something to be happy about. It would have been better had he passed to the second round. He didn't, but it is an important step. And that's how we work and how we want to think about the future. And on that note, I would like to pass on to our first speaker. I'm gonna start with Gareth and Santosh. Gareth is a professor of creativity at the Cardiff School of Art and Design, and Santhosh is professor at the Amrita School of Engineering in India. I'm not sure who is going to present. Is that going to be you, Gareth? I think so.
I think mainly, yeah.
Okay, all right. So I pass on to you now. You should be able to share your screen as well.
Thank you, Teresa. Hopefully people can see my screen, please. Yeah. So yeah, thank you for that. Just going to give you a few minutes to tell you a little bit about our project that we did together, Santhosh and I. I'm in the School of Art and Design, come from a design and engineering background, Santhosh from engineering. But this was a project sponsored by AHRC and part of the GCRF funding call, looking at healthcare in rural India. This was actually a project initiated more by Santhosh. They've been working with Indigenous communities in rural India for quite a long time, predominantly through engineering and medical approaches, but they're interested in getting me involved. I've known Santhosh for many years, about bringing that design element as well, to do a more multidisciplinary approach to looking at that, the challenges that they face there and have been facing. So the broad aim of the project was to look at this multidisciplinary partnership, bringing those three sort of skills together to see how we can improve the sort of, or help to improve the healthcare support for Indigenous communities, particularly in the Kerala state. We also were looking a little bit at Tamil Nadu state as well in southern India. So that was the start of the project. A little bit of background, 70% of the Indian population are in rural areas, and the Indigenous people make up 8.6% of the Indian population. They're known as Adivasis. In Kerala, in particular, 52% live in rural areas with a whole range of different tribal groups in terms of ethnicity, language, socioeconomic conditions. There's particular problems in terms of barriers of access to high-end healthcare, so that's why it was a particular challenge for us. Kerala has one of the highest life expectancies in India at almost 75 years, which is extremely high. But the Adivasis in Kerala is only 45 years. There's a big difference between the life expectancy of the Indigenous communities in the state versus the population. The sort of breakdown you can see of the tribal populations in a particular district of Kerala called the Wayanad district was where we did most of our research. We're particularly interested in that because actually the Indigenous population in the Wayanad district is 17%, so it's significantly higher. And Amrita have been working significantly in that area for quite a few years. I'll show you some examples in a second. Some of the core challenges that Santhosh had really highlighted from the work that he was doing before I got involved was that graduate doctors are reluctant to sort of serve in these tribal communities, so they'd rather stay in the big cities. So it's difficult to get that skill set out where it's needed. There's a lack of sort of amenities in general and special hospitals and education and transport linked to that. You have to travel often long distances to get to healthcare. And then the connectivity and the sort of maybe the technical infrastructure linking to specialty hospitals is a challenge. In some of the groups that Santhosh was working in, they have sponsored health workers linked to the key villages. So often those health workers are the key link between those tribal groups, the indigenous communities, and the actual hospitals themselves. Particular hospital that Amrita set up, charitable hospital in the Wayanad district, is here, and this is a group that we linked with, the Santhosh and myself, 3 other research students who work with us in the project, and the 2 people in the middle are the doctors who run this hospital. So this was the key link between the actual indigenous communities, and this was free healthcare service set up by Amrita for the indigenous communities in the Wayanad district. You can see the little jeep in the background, and that's so they can also get out to the villages and do healthcare directly in the villages themselves. So I just got a few photos for you, just get a feel for the spaces. This is one of the villages that Amrita had only relatively recently started working with, and it was one of the more poorer villages of the ones that are working. So you get a feel for the spaces. The person with the striped shirt there is the healthcare worker, and he was actually a key element I'll come back to, an important role that they play in the space. You can see some of the sort of environment and the cooking facilities. There was a well here for getting water. This was a picture of a second community, which was in a better situation in terms of its health and prosperity, partly because Amrita had been working with them longer, and they developed a more agricultural setup for them, so they were more self-sufficient in their food production. And there was also stronger links in terms of educational support. This particular person you see in the middle of the photo here was one a young man, but playing a big role in sort of linking that educational aspect to the communities. This is a third community, again, slightly more advanced again, where Amrita had built more. This is actually a hut for teaching, for the school and education. And what was interesting, you know, even the folks on healthcare, it was clear, obviously, that all these elements are interlinked through farming, through education, through healthcare support. You couldn't shouldn't really separate one from the other. They're so interlinked. One of the projects that Santhosh told me with before we started was that their installation and somewhat lack of success in installing toilets in the villages. And this was a nice indicator, it's just one example of many, where the villagers were reluctant to use these toilets. And when I saw them, I thought, yeah, I'm not so keen myself, to be honest. And so it was a really interesting sort of exploration, and was a key element that we were looking at, is how maybe how the way that we engage and Amrita themselves engaged with the communities maybe needed to evolve rather than just being purely engineering and medicine driven, of trying to find the solutions for them rather than necessarily understanding what was important to them and developing solutions with them from the ground up. So this was the motivation for the project and why Santhosh approached me in the first place. So he recognized that was very important. This is another village again. This is actually in Tamil Nadu, near Coimbatore. This is one of Santosh's colleagues, Srini, and this was probably the most advanced work that Amrita had done. Srini in particular was impressive individual of working with the Indigenous community, of getting them access to the rights of the land, which is always a big issue. They didn't have rights often over the land they had. He managed to secure the rights and used a very participatory design approach and more act as a facilitator to support the community group themselves in establishing an income through organic farming. Organic rice is a higher price, they can get more money for it, as well as feeding themselves. It was a very way of supporting the community. And it had a massive impact by doing this organic farming on the health of the community themselves. Not only that their nutrition improved, but alcoholism dropped significantly, and various other aspects improved on medical care through the initiative that Srini in particular had undertaken. So it's just some examples of some of the work predominantly that Amrita have done, and we worked with them. So this comes to the sort of, I guess, point that's known, what Paul made, is that, you know, historically, Indigenous communities work's been completed on them rather than with them. And I think this was something that we were sort of very much aware of, and trying to sort of not do that and include Indigenous communities in the way we were working. So some reflections on that before I finish. First of all, in terms of going out, we went out to some field work, as you saw from the photos, with various communities as the first part of the project. And what we noticed when we saw was that there were lots of efforts in the past to help these communities, very well intentioned, but usually were not sustained. For example, solar panels that were not working anymore, drinking water that was not being supplied properly, and so on and so forth. And I've seen this in other projects I've been involved in Africa, and this is a big issue. And then there becomes a lack of trust in the researchers going in to supposedly help them, but not necessarily ending up helping them really. So the result being sort of solutions ended up being temporary. So there's something that we noticed very much when I was certainly first going into those spaces. Unlike the project Amrita was doing, I think this is a very important principle, is that they've been running over several years. And so I think it's very important that, you know, if Western universities or groups are linking, they really do need to link with universities or organizations that have long-term relationships with the communities they're working in, so then it's more sustainable. And therefore, there's a high level of trust established between the villages and Amrita, because they proved and delivered. So there was a sustainable commitment to supporting the communities. And I think very important that any projects, I guess, that, you know, we consider doing or supporting, that should be, I think, part of it in planning a project from the onset. Another key factor in the success, I think, was the link of the healthcare worker, also in terms of having to do the research. So there's a healthcare worker linked with every particular village, and they had this, the villages had a love for this healthcare, different healthcare workers, but each one had a love for the associated healthcare worker in a particular village. And so when we went in, there was already this trust, there was this link, there was this connection. We weren't these unknown people, because they trusted the healthcare worker and the healthcare worker was introducing us. So that immediately allowed us the opportunity to talk and to discuss with the villagers and engage with the villagers and spend time with them. And that would never have been possible without that type of link. So I think that's a very important thing to think about if you're setting up these types of research projects. The actual sort of ethnographic work, if you want, was conducted by Amrita themselves. My role was more part of a training facilitation exercise to give them some guidance on maybe how to go about that and how to maximize it. They obviously spoke the local language, so they were also very respectful and empathetic of the villagers. One of the key sort of principles of Amrita is supporting Indigenous communities. So this was sort of embedded in their sort of approach as well, which I think was really important. The three research students that you saw in the photo, they're all under 30, one female, two males. And this was also very important to breaking down barriers and building that rapport. So again, I think that's very important thinking about if you're sort of setting up these types of projects. Based on that initial first part of the research work, we then went on to sort of workshops. And workshops was again more about training facilitation to share skills and approaches that the groups themselves could use more long-term beyond the length of this particular project. But it was also about exploring ideas and developing ideas as a group. And in it, we had a whole mix of people, some from Indian government, some from companies. We had the Indigenous community representatives. We had university students and staff, and the whole mix of different people there, I think, which was very important. So we got different perspectives on the challenges, which are quite complex, as I was suggesting. This was a quote in a way from the actual the tribal villagers who attended themselves and the healthcare workers. So they said they very much enjoyed the workshop in terms of they felt, and maybe they were somewhat surprised that they were treated with respect and as equals. And I think that was very important to them in the workshops. Interesting is some of the activities we did, which I do stuff around creativity. They tended to come up with much better solutions than any of the academics in the projects that I set them in the workshop, which didn't surprise me at all, as I expected that to happen, actually. But there were some challenges with communication. We had such a, not just within, let alone the Westerners, there was a few Westerners, but even with India itself, not all the people spoke the same language in India, so it was also a problem just within Indian participants. And I think we still struggled in how to translate the wonderful ideas that came out into action. So I still think we didn't do as good a job as I would have liked to have done. And I still think that's a challenge for us, how to make that really, really happen. So I was a bit frustrated on one level. Other points, I guess, more general points to finish. I think it's very important that as we try to do that, you have diverse backgrounds in the project. So this idea of sort of interdisciplinarity, I think, is very important and can be a challenge in funding bids with AHRC. and others. I know it's possible, but it's not necessarily as straightforward maybe as it could be. And obviously the involvement of the indigenous communities, the tribal villages, is obviously crucial in that. To say that even further, I think it's really important that, you know, the indigenous communities involved in the planning stages of the projects, and since they have the best ideas regarding their needs and the practicality of ideas that are generated, and often that's not done. I think Amartya Sen talks about development as freedom, and I think there's this idea of sort of understanding what's the purpose and what's the drive of those particular communities themselves is often overlooked, and I think it's really important that that should be the forefront of any sort of project and planning, and they're involved and maybe even reviewing projects as we sort of go through to see which ones should be implemented and which ones should be supported. So with that, I think we'll finish. And of course, finally, I guess each community is unique. So it's really not assuming that just because you worked in one area, that applies to another area automatically. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gareth. We're going to move on to the next presentation, and remember that please, you can write your questions on the chat so that we can then, Pedro is going to then help us with those, collecting them. Now we're going to move on to the next presentation. It's going to be Tony Crook. He is the Director of Research at the University of St. Andrews and a social anthropologist, and Kirsten MacLeod. She's a lecturer in film and television at Edinburgh Napier University, and they've been working with Livelihoods in Papua New Guinea. We've met in Rio 2 years ago, and it's fantastic to see you again and to be able to hear more about these challenges that you think are important today around your work. So please, I'm passing it to you. Tony, I think you're going to start the presentation.
Thank you. And thank you for that welcome and for mentioning our Indigenous partners, all of whom are victims at the moment of the COVID pandemic, just as we think in the UK that we're coming out of this. So our friends and colleagues in Brazil and places like Papua New Guinea are just coming into this. So having kept COVID out of the country, it's just recently exploded. So all of our Indigenous partners are unable to get near a viable internet connection. And Lily was hoping to make a film, and she's just unable to get onto the campus. They're under strict lockdown restrictions. So then they send their apologies. So Kirsten and I will do our best to voice and speak in the person of a team, which is a very Melanesian idea that you are not only your own person, you are made up of other people. And so when I'm speaking, so is Lily, and when Kirsten's speaking, so is Eriko Furefu. I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to address the kinds of priorities and the particularities that are emerging from these regions. I think that's a very helpful way of proceeding. And I'm really grateful that this webinar has been framed in terms, explicitly in terms of decolonization and ideas of epistemology and whose knowledges are we working with. Because of course, that's what anthropologists have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. I should say I'm the director of the Centre for Pacific Studies. It's the UK's only centre that deals with this region. So in thinking about how to make some of this legible in the space of 5 minutes before I pass over to Kirsten, I suppose I wanted to paint a bigger picture. That Melanesia only has 10 million people. And there are many regions of the world that have many more people than that and many more indigenous people than that. But somehow it's Papua New Guinea and Melanesia has had this massively disproportionate effect on my discipline and on social sciences. So all of our ancestors that we might point to as anthropologists and scholars, whether it's Malinowski or Hokart or Haddon, they all had their start in and around Melanesia. And it's no coincidence that this place has been incredibly provocative. So all of our theories of kinship, of gift, of the idea of politics, of what constitutes a person, our ideas of ritual, our ideas of land, our ideas of exchange and gender and cosmology and ontology, and the very notion of indigenous. All of these have absolutely failed in Melanesia in terms of descriptions and analysis. And we've had to remake them all in response to the force of Melanesian creativity and the life worlds and the ingenuity of a place that has more indigenous languages than anywhere else. It's not a coincidence that we find more cultures and more languages in Papua New Guinea and Melanesia. And this is really important because they insist on their descriptions of the world. They insist that anthropologists engage the world through their epistemologies and on their terms, in their languages, and through their conceptual schemes. You have no choice. This is the methodology that is presented to you, and you have to fit in with them rather than them fitting in with us. Papua New Guinea is one of the few places that got colonized and refused to be colonized. They have entirely resisted any attempt at other people describing their life world in terms other than their own. So to this long list of concepts that have crashed and burned in Melanesia, we can also add the very idea of knowledge and the very idea of methodology. These ideas just do not work as we would conventionally understand them in Melanesia. So rather naively, as an ambitious PhD student, I wanted to go to a place in the center of New Guinea, which is famous as the graveyard of anthropological careers. 20 PhDs had been done in this place and no one had been able to make sense of them. And the reason for this is that these people do knowledge. And that is something that academics and universities think that we do too. And we cannot imagine that knowledge isn't universal and it isn't something that we know and we can control, right? So it was a very enlightening and very uncomfortable experience to have to see through and have dismantled for me everything I knew about the world. Nothing in the anthropological toolkit would work in this place. No methodology of triangulation. If I checked with one person and checked with another, that was a sorcery accusation. My ideas of knowledge didn't find corollaries there. They have no word for knowledge. They have no concept for knowledge. Knowledge, what we would call knowledge, is skin. And so when I arrived, I asked, if I was a young man from here, how would I go about this? And they said, we have a customary path that young men follow of looking after the skin of an old person who may know, and you look after them and they will look after you. And knowledge will be, they would say that their skin has gone onto my skin has gone onto their skin, and we become one skin, one person. So knowledge in this place is part of a person. It's not an abstraction. It's not the content of a mind. It's not information. It's not a thing. It's relational. It's a body substance, and it passes to people and goes out into the world and makes things grow. So people are made up of the stuff of the world, and they move stuff around through what we would call knowledge of moving effects from this bit of the world into that bit of the world, and they can move it between people too. So this was an interesting place, as you might imagine, to think about knowledge and methodology. So when I asked how to go about it, they explained that there was this method and that this is the way to do it. This is the only way that you could do this and truly know. And so this exchange of knowledge is fundamentally about reciprocity. I would give things to an older person, they would look at my skin and think if I was ready for this incredibly dangerous new component to be added to my body, that if I got it too early, it could kill me, right? But when I was ready for it, I might need to know, and they would, under those circumstances, give it to me. So I suppose I want to say that it's not only this little village called Bolovit where I worked, it's right across Melanesia that knowledge is a part of a person, and it only works in relationships and through other people. When someone says a spell, then it's not the words that work, it's the fact that they've learnt it from someone else, and it's their efficacy that works. So the little video that we were just shown from Brazil, people in Bolivia, in Papua New Guinea, would want to know who these people are, how are they related, why are they women, why are they dressed in this way, were they kind to the people that they learned from, how well do they know this knowledge, is this really their knowledge, whose efficacy is being demonstrated, what are their ideas of beauty that are being transferred in that performance that we were given, right? How are they imagining that to affect us? How does that power of knowledge come? They would want to know all about that, because that's how they would read knowledge. So with reciprocity, you have to be very, very careful about the promises you make. So if I promise that there's going to be a publication at the end of something, there has to be a publication at the end of something. If I promise that there's going to be future funding, there has to be future funding, right? This knowledge, this data is bits of other people. It implicates their health. And if we don't do it, it exposes those people and me to sorcery accusations. And that has happened. So when we, Kirsten, Lily, Erico and ourselves thought about what we do for the case study, we worked with an organization called KUSWA, and we focused on participatory filmmaking and gender violence in Papua New Guinea, in the place where there are sorcery burnings and accusations and killings and beatings every week, if not every day at the moment. And we started our case study by trying to convey this idea that knowledge comes through people. So there's a parable at the beginning of our case study, which is about someone finishing a zoological book about birds in partnership with a New Zealand ornithologist stroke anthropologist. And he said, look, the book's not finished. I've got to explain how I came to know this. So right at the end, on the way to the airport, they turned around, went back to the university and wrote the last chapter, which is how I walked around the forest with my mother and I learned these things. I don't know this, I only know this, and I only know it because it's my mother. So those specificities about people and persons is absolutely crucial. So we also focused, and I suppose this is what I want to focus on before I hand over to Kirsten, is that with KUSWA, it was very clear to us that it was easy to engage the front stage, so to speak, of how to deal with Indigenous organizations and people and think about reciprocity, to think about ethics, to think about respect and empathy and all these kinds of things. But we also realized that we didn't have to engage the backstage, that we didn't have to engage in their epistemology. And yet Erico, who was doing this work, clearly was. So I would like the group to think about how we actually engage that backstage, how we enter into other people's epistemologies and ontologies, and we enter into their life worlds on their terms, right? So you'll see that I think now, a think piece that I sent in my stead to Rio, I think that's available and it's being shared. And there's a couple of questions there which maybe distill some of these anthropological points. Is the task of engaging Indigenous peoples and their knowledge and their methods the much tougher challenge of entering into other people's life worlds on their own terms and in their epistemologies? Does focusing on common characteristics of indigeneity and symmetries amongst epistemologies actually serve to obscure the very ontological differences that we need to attend to? These front stage protocols are all very well and they're incredibly important. They're more apparent, they're easier to engage, but it's the backstage, it's the space where our own languages and descriptions fail, where our Indigenous partners turn it into vernacular knowledges and vernacular languages and work with those ideas. That's the place that is so difficult to enter into. Took me 3 years of learning the language. and figuring out a completely different way of thinking about the world to even begin to understand what was going on. So it seems to me that we have a real responsibility to deal in the terms, the values and the realities of Indigenous life worlds, rather than them expecting them to translate into a Euro-American epistemology that controls what counts. We dictate what's real. We can say this is the stuff that can be measured, and we have a system of knowledge that dominates. Unless we enter into their life world, then we won't get into the backstage, which is where our Indigenous partners are doing the translation work, where the real Indigenous knowledge action is happening. Now, I realize I've run over, but I hope that we can find time for Kirsten to follow up and voice some of Lily's thoughts on these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Hi, everybody. It's lovely to be here, and it's really nice to see familiar faces. I'm going to speak really purely on behalf of Lily Sarr, Dr. Lily Sarr, who's our partner in Papua New Guinea. She's director of the Centre for Social and Creative Media at the University of Goroka. Lily's in the process of authoring a piece at the moment for this group. So really, I'm just going to summarise a few of the points that she's in the process of developing at the moment. And she asked us to give her apologies for not being able to attend. Lily writes, research to gain profound knowledge is to help the community. If knowledge was gained, yet not used to help community, it is meaningless. Lily asks, a crucial question to ask would be, whose research is this? Who owns it? Whose interest does it serve? Who benefits? These are the questions that participants of research may ask, and I have been asked this question so many times. People are skeptical about researchers and are not willing to share information due to bad experiences they may have had with researchers. Research is considered to be a way that Western assumptions and perceptions have been imposed on Indigenous cultures. And there were two key points, two key challenges that Lily's asked us to highlight on her behalf. One, Indigenous researchers, the importance of supporting, enabling, funding, and of training young Indigenous researchers. And a second point, and of course related, is of developing Indigenous research methodologies. Lily highlights Indigenous researchers. An Indigenous researcher is accountable to community, to maintain community relationships. The general perception of being an Indigenous researcher is that when I gain knowledge as a researcher, I am not just getting some abstract idea. This is following on from what Tony was saying. Instead, I am gaining knowledge in order to fulfill my responsibility to community and to the people to whom I have a relationship. Therefore, research is not something that is out there, but is something that you're building for yourself and for your community. I'm going to just scroll through because I'm aware of time here. In relation to Indigenous research methodologies, Lily stresses the importance of a good understanding of research methodologies for conducting research in Indigenous communities. She says, so much research has been done in Indigenous communities, but despite the best intentions, there are inherent tensions between a commitment to the principles of participatory and ethical research and the expectations of funding agencies and academia. And I'm sure we're all familiar with this. Strict adherence to ethical guidelines and research protocols does not necessarily translate into daily good practice of research. And more significantly, there may not be the funding, the capacity, and I think crucially the time frame to allow all parties to devote energy and resources to follow through on the ideal. Lily also highlights the accountability of Indigenous researchers to community and how this can be really demanding as a person protecting cultural values and the tensions that lie in. On a note of moving forward, Lily suggests really the importance here of documenting the perspectives of community-based and Indigenous researchers and the strength that they can bring to the research process. And just, to highlight, just to finish on that, really, just to highlight the good work we've done at the Centre for Social and Creative Media at the University of Goroka, who engage with media-related, Indigenous research methodologies. And also another example being the Vanuatu Cultural Centre's, their Indigenous field worker programme is a great example of how external researchers must work with and train local researchers. So a few points on behalf of Lily, who apologises that she can't be with us today. Thank you.
Thank you both, Tony and Kirsten and Lily. Fantastic to hear your thoughts and to add to what Gareth had been saying. I think it's important what you highlight, this point of reciprocity. I think we discussed a lot of that in Rio, and it's good to bring it back. And this idea of the epistemologies I find very fascinating. Of course, the whole issue of translation. Lots to discuss, but we need to move on to the next presentation. I'm going to invite Caroline Upton. She's a professor of human geography at the University of Leicester, and Stanley Kimaren Ole Riamit, I hope I pronounced that well, founder and director of the Indigenous Livelihoods Enhancement Partners in Kenya. And it's great to have you here again and to see you and share this moment. Please, Caroline.
Kimaren is going to start our presentation, so I'll hand over to him to start.
Okay, thank you, Stanley.
Yes, thank you very much, and it's really great seeing some of us again here since Rio, and I really must appreciate the convenience of this for bringing this question to discussion, because it should have happened like a few years back, but we are here for it, and I should thank you. And I also have the pleasure to really appreciate again the opportunity given for us here in Africa, pastoralist Maasai in particular, to speak to this question. So very quickly, I will share the experiences of the Maasai pastoralist here in Kenya with respect to research and some of the challenges. I think some of you who might have been in the field of research, particularly anthropology and range ecology for a while, will appreciate that the Maasai has been a very popular research subject, to the extent of being very highly romanticized, with very little credited to them, both in terms of the knowledge generated and how this knowledge is applied. We have also often seen the trend of bringing participants of Indigenous people, Maasai, to the research at the tail end, when concepts and questions for the research processes, administrative arrangements, resource allocation have been sealed and settled. So more like what we had earlier, often research on them and very much less with them. So oftentimes they are reduced to filler materials, co-opted into the research enterprise, as opposed to active ingredients and equal partners. Their role in research has often been facilitating the effective realization of preset objectives within a pre-established research framework, and very much less of equitable research partners with agency to reframe, adjust the course of the research. They are often brought in as interpreters, guides, and respondents, and very rarely as researchers in equal measure. And further, little of their unique concerns because of this peripheral role in shaping the research. Little of their unique concerns and interests and perspectives show up in the ultimate analysis of the research and the authorship ultimately. Most of the time, this analysis and authorship happens in the North with minimal validation by Indigenous communities, especially the Maasai in this case. This research, like I think Tony was saying, a site in Papua New Guinea that has produced 20 PhDs is true for this, in the case of the Maasai. As research sites have enriched and enabled proliferation of academicians in diverse fields and disciplines from the North, but often leaving a trail of illiteracy within the research data source communities, particularly because the research project scholarship attached to the projects are often locked for Northerners. Ultimately, this approach reproduces prevailing asymmetries of power with respect to Western epistemological influence in research. So you find that even benefits attached to research projects are to maintain pre-existing systemic and structural Indigenous people non-responsive outcomes. So Indigenous institutions and communities get the short end of the stick in terms of research resources must come through a university that may not have even a relationship with Indigenous peoples. And often it's because the fiduciary standard of accounting do not exist. And therefore the bureaucratic arrangement ends up excluding resource reaching to the hands of Indigenous people. So very quickly, these are some of the challenges. But this workshop, I think, is some of the light at the end of the tunnel. I would say with the project we had with Professor Upton, Caroline, on pastoral resilience, another good thing that we saw in this project is trying to communicate research out, bringing them back and making an attempt to put them in a form and language that communities can easily interact with. So they were written in Ma language, the Indigenous language of the Maasai. But as we look forward, as we project ahead, so that I give my colleague time, we therefore need to really rethink how we do this research. We need to find strategies to move Indigenous community from a paradigm of being co-opted and being just informers into proactive originators, questioners, influencers, opinion shapers, and owners or co-owners of research outcomes. We need to target research design and avoid a blanket policy informed by the practice in the North. These are unique landscapes, unique cosmologies and epistemologies that need very unique and targeted approaches. We need to break loose from the hegemonic outsider stranglehold on research enterprise, process, content, outputs, and resources. We need to think how to fairly, inclusively redistribute the so-called authoritative voice, often ascribed to Northern and Western researchers on account of their research being real, rigorous, objective, and Indigenous people research being nativist and subjective. We also need to think about, therefore, what mix of enablers will facilitate research space and practice that will allow Indigenous people to weave their own narratives, to tell their own stories in their own voices. And I think the story by Tony and Lily of research being accountable to communities and enabling Indigenous people to respond to their concerns is critical. How to bank the myth that answers to the most critical questions of Indigenous people lie outside their own knowledge base. That actually in co-production and respectable partnership there is a chance to gain from each other. How, therefore, to facilitate Indigenous people to tap into their own values, their abilities, and their commitments as agents of change. And I should thank you for listening to me, and look forward to respond to any comments and questions. Back to Carol. Thank you.
Thank you, Kimaren. I'll just very briefly then to make a few additional comments, if I may. I realise we're running a bit late in this session, so I really just wanted to just really comment again and reinforce what other people have said about the importance of developing, sustaining these partnerships of mutual trust and respect between Indigenous and non-Indigenous researchers, and thinking of us very much as research teams in particular endeavours. And really going back to something Teresa said about trying to be sort of positive and optimistic, even in the very challenging situation with regards to UK funding. This is something that I know we're not focusing on the funding landscape today, but is there space for thinking about new small areas of innovation in the current sort of funding landscape, or we might move out of these large ODA type projects and think about more innovative spaces where we might bring in some of these co-development approaches throughout the whole project cycle. Maybe we can find some sort of optimism around that. I mean, conversely, I fear that the growing rhetoric and the reality of extinction around, urgency around the extinction, conservation and climate crisis may start to close down some of these spaces and put more emphasis on technological solutions. It may reinforce particular hierarchies of knowledge that we're seeking to dismantle in many ways. And I think in Kimaren and I's Resilient Pastoralism project, we saw a really small example of that, in that we did a lot of interdisciplinary work, diverse methods, trying to work with Indigenous methods and approaches. But when these were presented to local policymakers throughout the project, there was a really marked tendency to try and disentangle what was seen as the high-tech, scientific knowledges from this package. So, for example, we used remote sensing, but we kind of talked about how that might fit with Indigenous ways of viewing the landscape. But when it came to that policy interface, there was a tendency of the policymakers to take out that technical element. So there's something there about how some of these knowledges may be feeding through into the policy process. And I think really just to close, because I know we're very short of time, I just wanted to go back to this issue of co-production of knowledge, which we've all been talking about in various ways, and it's obviously central to what we're trying to do here. And I came across Van der Hel's three-way categorization of the logics of co-production of knowledge. And they talk about the logics of accountability, of impact, and of humility. And how very often when we enact co-production, it's focused on enhanced responsiveness and uptake of research. But that third logic, that logic of humility, is very easily sidelined. And I think really that's one that we all need to take to heart and continue to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kimaren and Caroline. Again, very enriching and thought-provoking. I have a question. Maybe this is gonna make people think a little bit about ideas or questions they want to ask. With what Tony was saying, but I think everyone in general, Kimaren and Caroline also mentioned these things, the issue of translation, of how different knowledges are understood and translated. And I don't know if you've come across the work of Marisol de la Cadena. She's an anthropologist working in Peru, who has been really pushing this idea of translation and whether or not some different ways of knowing or epistemological approaches or ways of being in this world, ontological practices, can be translated, and whether or not there is an issue there in terms of trying really hard to translate things that maybe can't be translated. I don't know, what is your thoughts? What are your thoughts on that?
No, anthropologists have been arguing this for a century. And for the last 15 years, there's been a raging debate around ontology, which was kicked off by a Brazilian professor, Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, and an American anthropologist, Roy Wagner, and a British anthropologist, Marilyn Strathern. And I think you're right to pick up on the limitations of the idea of translation that says that this must be possible, that we will find corollaries. And I think that speaks to the challenge I was posing, that actually we've got to give up on our own epistemology as a reference point. And as much as we might imagine it's possible to go native and to fully understand, that would mean that researchers are unique human beings in being able to shrug off our own epistemology and our own culture. So the only answer, and it's the answer that all three of these anthropologists pose, is that we use the awareness of our own conceptual field as a vantage point on another conceptual field and epistemology. And it's only in that relationship. So it's an exchange. Every time we look at something which is kind of confounding and counterintuitive in Papua New Guinea, the first reaction that we train into anthropologists is to think, why do your thoughts travel that way? Why do you think that? What does that tell us about our assumptions? And so it's a binocular vision, and it's teaching us about our own life world. And we could not, culture wouldn't work if we were fully aware of every thought and feeling and value. We are all the product of our own particular histories, and we've learnt about the world through our own life stories and paths and through particular people in particular ways. But it's bundled in with a whole lot of assumptions and folk models, which we take for granted. So we teach anthropologists that if you get to the field and something looks familiar, you're wrong, right? That your first assumption is always wrong. And then to work in relationship between these two conceptual schemes. And that's where the space for dialogue becomes possible for research in an intellectually kind of vigorous way, and in the way that people in Papua New Guinea or the Maasai will recognize, because they know that other people see the world differently. But taking their vision of being human and their problems and what research is for seriously as the starting point, and not, as we heard, bringing people in after the terms have been set. I think that's absolutely crucial. But I think for me as an anthropologist, the issue that sticks out in all of this is to what extent we're just dealing with the front stage of engaging with people and saying, well, we can be nicer and more ethical, and we can deal with people with more respect and all the rest of it. We can do all of that without actually having to touch, the burning hot stove, which is that in their world, their descriptions work better than ours. And that we take seriously that these people are acting out their own social analysis of what's going on, that they're working with their own theories of being. And unless we enter into that world, then I think we have no business there. We have no business there. Otherwise, we're just doing the opposite of decolonization. We are imposing a colonial vision of an epistemology which controls people through a description of their world in our terms. And there's a fundamental human right to living a life through one's own epistemology and through one's own life world. And I think there's a real danger, and perhaps a real danger for a program such as this, that doesn't take that next step and engage seriously in other people's life worlds and realize that we are simpletons, that we are naive. We might be experts, we might be scholars, but in terms of their life worlds, we're like 3-year-old kids, and it takes a great deal of humility to put behind us an idea that we know what knowledge is and what universities are for and what research is for and all of those sorts of things, and to see it from the perspective of the participants, that from their point of view, why they're doing this is that they're going to get something back. So I think that the idea of training Indigenous people is crucial. So I got my job at St Andrews and told them to that I wouldn't take it unless they gave me a PhD for a Papua New Guinean woman to do a PhD, and eventually they did, and now we're training 4 Papua New Guineans in anthropology as a way of giving something back. But that can be done in the field too. You know, people have their own ideas of how to find knowledge out, how to do things, how to solve problems, and they know their problems in a way that we never will. So we've got to be, you know, enablers. We've got to be humble. We've got to be, you know, subordinate, and we've got to give up thinking that we know best and that our epistemologies are universal descriptions. That's really hard, and that goes way beyond translation.
Great, thank you very much, Tony. I think there are a few more questions on the chat, but I have the feeling we might need to move on to the next session. And just there's one word that sticks to me here. It's humility. That's Caroline has said that. You, Tony, I think Kimaren in many ways said that. Gareth, everyone has mentioned that, and perhaps that's a really, really good place from where we can leave this part of the session, but also start the next one. So I'll give it back to you, Paul.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for all the presenters here.
Thank you.
So just before we get past, I pass on to Giovanna. Tony's think piece, which he provided for Rio, even though he couldn't come. Thiago's put it up in the chat here. So there were also 12 case studies, and Thiago, I think, has also put up the link to that. And there's a playlist. I love that word playlist. I had to think what he meant by that. But there's a playlist of some very short little videos which capture something of the interactions, and I think they're all themed, so you can look through them and see the sort of interest subjects you might want to follow. And also just to say that Kimaren, Lily, Gareth are also working on some new texts that we're going to be sharing with the whole group. And of course, Giovanna is going to be sharing one of those, is writing one of those pieces. I'm sure it's going to be influenced by the next session. I'm going to hand over to Dr. Giovanna Facetta, who's lecturer in intercultural literacies and languages in education at the University of Glasgow. I can see a Scottish theme coming through this seminar this time. Giovanna and her colleague, Dr. Maria Grazia Imperiali, wrote the think piece, Indigenous Engagement, Research Partnerships and Knowledge Mobilisation, which very much gave birth to this process that we've been on. So we're really delighted to have Giovanna back. I think Giovanna is going to talk us about how we're going to segue into the next session as well. So Giovanna, thank you.
Hi everyone, and as others have said, great to see some familiar faces here from the Rio days. As Paul was saying, my colleague Maria Grazia Imperiale and I drafted a think piece, or wrote a think piece in 2018, and that is actually, we're in the process of updating it and trying to bring in the newest pieces of research. So what the think piece was doing was really looking at, it was an extended literature review, which took into consideration academic writing that had happened between 2013 and 2018, and really exploring it according to a set of headings that were given to us by the ESRC. That piece was actually commissioned by the ESRC. And this was one of the things that we brought to Rio and to the conversation. So looking at Indigenous knowledges in available research, what are the gaps, what are the strengths, what are the ways forward? And the session today that we would like to do, which is a very practical kind of workshop session where people go into the breakup rooms, is based on one of the main points that emerged from when we were doing this extended literature review. And one of the things, amongst others, but one of the things that Grazia and I observed was that in the available literature, there was very little, if nothing but really rare reflections in academic literature about what doesn't go according to plans, about what doesn't quite work the way that we expect it to. A real lack of open reflexivity about the things that do not quite work as planned. And we were thinking there is so much to learn from the things that don't work, but there is really very little incentive in talking about the things that don't go according to plans in academic literatures, in academic presentation, and everything is always presented as everything worked absolutely fine, and and there's no question about, okay, so was it the methodology really participatory? Did we actually manage to involve participants, and were participants feeling included and participating? So this type of reflection about what didn't work really is not there. There is perhaps a little bit more now in public fora where people discuss the things that don't quite work as well as they should have. But still, if you go to your academic literature, everything works as fantastically. And so Grazia and I were thinking, okay, are we the only ones that ever had a problem? Are we the only ones where that actually we planned something, but that something else happened? Or is this, I mean, it reminded me of what, apropos of something quite different, but Abdelmalek Sayad talking about the migrants and the way in which migrants portray their lives abroad. He called it the collective lie, something about in which everyone takes part in building this pretend world, and nobody can really be the first one to say, actually, no, for me, it didn't work that way, because then everyone said, but everyone else is fine. So what is wrong with you? And this dimension we felt that was really lacking. So in today's, and I won't take any longer because we're already running very late. So in today's session, we'll go into breakup rooms. And the idea is to discuss in the breakout rooms, so what were the main lessons, useful lessons that in doing your research that you would like to share? Did you experience any challenges or unexpected developments during a project? And if so, what did you do to redress and overcome these challenges? The idea is that we can learn from others' people's mistake, and there might be valuable lessons that we can learn in discussing the things that don't go according to plan, because it's usually in that gap that things actually emerge about expectations, about preconceptions, about the ways in which things don't quite match, the way in which we see the world don't quite match, as we were hearing, and where we can actually learn. And this is a process, not something that we can learn, okay, tick the box, this is what I need to do, but it's a process of learning, of discussing, of being open about what works and what actually doesn't. So I have actually, so to try and keep this or put this back on track, I think if we stay in the breakout room for about 50 minutes and then discuss these questions, and then we will do the usual report back. I realize that at this point, many of you will want to, have a minute to make a cup of coffee or pop to the toilet or do something. So as you move into the breakout rooms, perhaps you want to take a couple of minutes for a wee break. But I'll put in the chat here. There you go. What I hope is some instructions. I've reduced it, the breakout rooms to 15 minutes. I hope that's okay with Paul, because to try and keep back in track. And with the report back will be 15 minutes. So really a couple of minutes each, just of headlines. I've also created a Padlet, which you have a link for there. So to use a little bit as we do with post-it notes in the physical world. But if you feel that that's just clunky and it makes you waste your time, feel free also to disregard that. The idea was that we all post it there and we can see what other people are putting, and that might elicit other ideas, other thoughts. So we will have 15 minutes in breakup rooms, and then everybody back. And please remember to appoint someone to just feedback, so that we've got someone from each group. So thank you everyone, and sorry, I realized that this had a lot less time than it was originally planned, so you probably had just about time to get to know each other, and then it was time to come back. But I wonder whether you had time to start sort of thinking around, this sounds really negative, but it doesn't actually mean to be negative. But what things do we want to think about, to be, to know about that might not quite work? And is this a useful angle? And so if anyone from room 1, which had a focus around global health and well-being, or at least on paper, does anyone want to report back from room 1? You'll have about, I said 3 minutes, Paul said 5 minutes, so let's put it up 4.
I guess maybe I will. I was in that group, and yes, it was predominantly just getting to know each other and sharing areas, so we didn't talk. But I was hoping to actually ask Santhosh to tell a story. I know he was in another breakout group to me, but he told me a story in line with your question, Giovanna, around trying to improve hemoglobin levels in one of the indigenous communities in India, and it didn't work out very well. I don't know, Santhosh, if you remember that story and if you're willing to share.
See, in India, this indigenous communities always receive a lot of attention because they are not getting limelight, and because they are a good percentage of the population. So people try to help them and try to get maximum publicity out of it. That's one sad thing about it. And there are a few NGOs, non-governmental organizations, trying to really help them out by providing protein-rich food. So they distributed groundnut packets in the morning to all the indigenous community families. And they took the count of the hemoglobin count before 6 months. Again, they took the count, so that the hemoglobin count has come down after giving the peanut packets every day, and 1 packet for every member of the family. So this, they were very surprised to see these negative results. And then they did a study, and they found that giving the peanuts, the alcoholism in the family has gone up, and whatever income was otherwise saved also was taken for buying as for eating with that. So this is what I was also sharing in the breakout room, that providing television to the houses also had a negative impact. Gareth, do you remember that small boy was sleeping at the midday at 12 noon in the sunlight? He was sleeping without me even knowing that he was sleeping in the sunlight, because he was watching TV throughout the night, and he started sleeping early at the morning, and he was still sleeping at 12 o'clock at noon. So this kind of negative impacts can be there. We might be thinking it's a wonderful solution. I'm not sure, because you are able to understand my English, because it's not a westernized accent. So I hope I'm trying to speak with you, but I'm not sure if you are able to understand my English.
I think it's very good, Santhosh.
So
your English is fine, Santhosh, sorry.
Yeah, so we have to be extremely careful when we are providing solutions. We have to make sure that it is really acceptable, it works for them. And another good thing is that when we work with these indigenous communities, we should not think that we are doing them a favor. We also have a lot of things to learn from them, especially in terms of looking at the life as it is. Even with 10 rupees, in India we have, even without that 10 rupees also they are happy. Even if they have 100 rupees, they are happy. So that level of happiness is, you can really see that it is decoupled from the income they have. And also that what we called as the togetherness of that neighborhood. So let us say, because of their family healthcare and all, it's not good. Sometimes post-delivery, the mother may not survive. Such cases are there. But that kid will not grow as an orphan. The kid will be adopted by that neighborhood. And the kid will grow by, it will be taken care of by that neighborhood, and it just like gets almost all the care that he would otherwise get. So there are many things we could learn from them, but we can also help them. So these are the things I would like to share.
Thank you very much, Santhosh. And I think that's a very important point about contextualizing and making sure that whatever we do is appropriate to the context and not appropriate to our understanding of the context or assumptions on the context. Do we have anything, any report back from group 2, which was looking at Indigenous rights, again on paper, I guess, then it might have been different.
Yes, I was elected at the very last moment as the person to feed back. So I didn't take copious notes. But I've scribbled down 2 things, which is, one, we did think back, we cast our minds back to the original case studies and the meeting in Rio. And there was quite a lot of discussion in those original case studies and at the meeting in Rio about what went wrong, or structures that we felt were unhelpful. Yeah, I guess the other thing that we could add to this is that perhaps if we reframe that question and kind of change structures that demand right or wrong answers, not necessarily your question, Johanna, but the way that research projects are conceived, then we might be in a different environment where as researchers we can also work in a different way that that just moves beyond that impasse, that having, you know, a sense of things going wrong, because it doesn't do us any good either.
Thank you, Thea. And I mean, I totally agree. And the idea is precisely that we should value, you know, whatever happens is what happens. And if things don't go according to plan, we've got something to learn from that. That's part of the process. That's part of the learning, but it's not encouraged. And you're where the think pieces that came to Rio all had this dimension. If when you go to official knowledge, which is the one in the journals, and there's nothing there, or there's very, very little there. And why does that happen? Why is there no encouragement about having a clear, honest discussion about what happens and what happens that is different from what we expected would happen? The group 3 looked at gender inequality, and do you have anyone that's going to do a quick?
Hi, Giovanna. Yeah, thank you for that. I've got sort of 3 sort of brief points for me. So we spoke about gender-based violence in relation to and gender equality in relation to community engagement through filmmaking. And I think it went sort of back to that original point of us in some previous sessions in terms of humility, but also combined with adaptability in terms of COVID impacts. There was also a question, sort of more of a provocative question about, is gender violence something that is considered a colonial process by the communities, which is a sort of quite powerful thought. And then I think Kirsten mentioned this in our group, about having Indigenous partners there, especially access to women and women on board in these projects, when there sort of seems to be sort of previously sort of male dominated and sort of male perceptions. And she sort of says about sort of openness and adaptability. And I think she referenced old Granada TV programs, Disappearing Worlds, which I understand was sort of more focused on male perceptions rather than women perceptions. So yeah, that's all we had.
Thank you very much. That was very effective and efficient. And it's I've lost track. Wait a minute. And it's, do we have anything back from group 4, which was looking at sustainable management, or grouped around sustainable management, I should say?
Hiya. Yeah, we were talking with Santhosh about the need not to impose our own value systems. And then Lydiane was telling us about a project that she's been running in Brazil, in forest areas, so around the idea of sustainable tourism, and based on citizen science methods, which I think is a really interesting thing to think about, because it's very increasingly sort of common method in science-based conservation subjects as well now. But she was pointing out a specific challenge in the project. They wanted to hire people from the city, especially students, to train them up. So it was this idea of training students being a really important capacity building. However, she was pointing out the contrary to that, a different opportunity could have been to hire people from the community and to train them to do it instead. So, and that was a kind of key point. And then I was trying to have a think of any extra thoughts, and I thought about time for adaptability, which is something I found in my project when I was doing ethnobotanical recording of local plant uses. The need to, I had to record it in the sort of local Nubian language as well as the Arabic, and it just, the need to take the time to do that properly, and to understand the sort of plant knowledge systems. So needing that kind of adaptability, that you can't just start writing it down in sort of questionnaires and forms. And something else that cropped up for adaptability was, actually, I was printing a resource while I was there and distributing it, and that took about 2 to 3 weeks longer than I expected, just because of the process it took. So there's that sort of flexibility in project time as well. Just a quick reflection on the journals, because I think we probably all find out. I'm writing a paper at the moment, and it's just on this work in Nubia, and there's always this very prescribed format in lots of journals, and we do very interdisciplinary work, and then when we get to the journals, we find often that we're put back into a specific disciplinary lane, and they're often saying, well, you know, ideally please use these headings, and I think that's a problem.
Thank you, Philip. And yeah, and another thing is when you're told actually that doesn't fit with our journals, and you thought it fit really well, but they don't see that because it's not precisely from that discipline, is it? Yeah, thank you. And we will move on to, I had something in my mind, but it's gone. We will move on to group 5 that was grouped around cultural heritage. And did you have time for any conversation, discussion?
By the time we'd gone through introductions like the other groups, we didn't have much time for discussion. focusing on cultural heritage, one of the concerns, and this will probably be common to all the other groups, was the whole question of getting access to work with research partners. So we began the discussion around some of those infrastructural issues, ranging from environmental challenges, hurricanes, but also just to issues of bandwidth and communicating with partners, downloading films produced. So we spent the time we spent some time focusing on that. But given the topic, cultural heritage, we also had some discussion around specific questions of copyright and intellectual property as well. And I'm not sure whether anybody else in Group 5 wants to come in with any specific examples of that.
Anyone else from Group 5 that wants to build on Charles's point?
I think I mentioned, well, I'm trying to find Abhijit, who is undertaking.
Yes. Abhijit could maybe speak to intellectual property.
Hi, this is Abhijit. I'm doing my PhD research at Queen Mary University of London. We discussed on different issues, and with respect to intellectual property, we were discussing on how indigenous IPs, basically the traditional knowledges and the traditional cultural expressions, they don't have a similar protection measure as compared to the industrial IP, as we see the patent, copyright, trademark, design, and everything else, which is there in the IP domain. And even though we have been having a debate of biopiracy and bioprospecting, where the traditional knowledges are taken for making the new medicinal knowledges, medicinal products. And we see the fashion industry taking the tribal dresses and implementing them into the fashion industry. We see traditional cultural expressions being incorporated in the movies, like the famous Hakuna Matata that is taken from a Swahili phrase. The Baba Yaga used in John Wick is a Slovakian term, which was falsely represented rather in John Wick. Baba Yaga doesn't actually means the boogeyman. It means it is an old story of a legend of a witch, an old witch. And so these things, in absence of a stronger protection regime, the indigenous community faces two types of challenges. First is the economic challenges, basically, that they don't get to exploit their own indigenous IPs in the manner they want to, and they don't get the benefit also out of it. When Twilight series created the narrative on the Quellet tribe, where Jacob Black and the family came from, the descendant of the wolves, they didn't share, the production was never shared any money with the Quellet tribe actually. And they just used the legend of the Quellet tribe. And the second thing that they see is if there is a misrepresentation that is happening, then such misrepresentations lead to what we say is dilution of the identity or misrepresentation of the community. So somebody who is not from the community will have a distorted idea about the cultural practices of the community or the understanding of the community because of the misrepresentation, and the communities might not have a chance to correct those narratives. So these are the two challenges that in intellectual property field that I believe that is being faced, and I'm working and researching upon them still. So it's a primitive stage, but yeah.
Thank you very much. And I think there's a very important point there. And I remember one of the pieces that we read for the think piece that actually addressed precisely this challenges, and in particular in relation to what is quite popular at the moment, like the alternative medicine or certain diets and all the effects that this has on communities with the pushing up of prices and all the rest of it, as well as issues around representation, and just a kind of by being sort of very fast and very and unfortunately also quite superficial, but we've brought this back more or less into the timing that it should have. And maybe just thank you for everyone for your patience and for doing this, for going along with this. And I think that maybe we'll link this to what was being said at the end, and I can't remember who it was that was saying it at the end of, is it Kirsten? No, Caroline. I think about the fact of doing something a little bit more creative, a little bit more, and seeing whether there are thinking outside the box, and maybe whether this thinking outside the box could also bring us to research that leaves open space for something to emerge, for not having to have everything when we did A, B, C, D, we obtained 1, 2, 3, 4, research that is not metrics and that allows for the messiness of life to actually be what we're looking at. And back to more or less on track, 7 minutes late. Thank you. Back to you, Paul.
Giovanna, thank you so much, and thank you to everyone. I am very struck by the fact that this is our penultimate meeting of this cycle, not our ultimate meeting. And one of the main reasons why we set up this particular meeting at this time was to plan for wherever we want to go to in September. So there is this idea that we still have, that we're going to meet again in September as this group, and hopefully as more people. It probably will, and almost inevitably be still on Zoom, or it may be a hybrid sort of meeting. Let's think about that. But the UKRI, or ESRC and AHRC specifically, want to for us to meet again. We're going to send out invitations for that meeting. And we want to provide a bit of a chance today to think about what that might look like. And so although we've only had a very little time to debate in this particular session, I'm hearing all sorts of things that I know that would be really interesting to think about, to include. So I'm hoping that we're going to end this afternoon by just raising a few of these subjects. What would you like that to look like? How would it be structured? Do we want more think pieces, writing, talking? Do we want to talk about Indigenous, about property rights? Do we want to devote it entirely to climate change? If you remember those who participated in May, it was very much about the pandemic. Do we want to think about emerging from the pandemic, whatever that might look like? So we want to start from now through onwards, not just today, but going forward, to consult with you so we can share with UKRI about what that may look like. It may be an Anglia meeting. It may be then we've got other things that we really want to say about where we are in terms of ODA and the direction of research. We started this journey 3 years ago. The committee first met in 2017. It was a very different landscape from the one we have now. So I would like to make sure we preserve that time at the end of the afternoon to think about those. But what we have now is something incredibly special, and it was something that we really thought about with various people from May, to give space for an Indigenous philosopher, thinker, to share with us ideas about where we are at the moment. And I can't think of a better way to go into this discussion about what we want to do in September and what the future is going to look like. I am incredibly grateful to Lucia Sarr, who has made this possible, that Ailton Krenak can be with us, to provoke us, to help us to think, and to give us direction. For obvious reasons, we haven't been able to risk doing this live. It would have been impossible. And you'll see even in the video that we prepared that there are breaks in the transmission, but thanks to subtitles, of course, it feels like a continuous piece. So apologies to those that speak Portuguese, you will hear less than you actually read in English on the subtitles. This very much comes out of a case study. Really a combination of two case studies. What's great about having these opportunities. So Lucia has this wonderful case study, a wonderful project that she's been doing with Ailton Krenak, and we've been doing a project with the actor Simon McBurney, working with the Indigenous peoples in the Mayoduna and the Xingu, the Kwikuru people. So we asked the two of them to have a conversation, and it's a conversation that we've recorded, edited, and we're going to play for you now. Obviously, we will just play it. By all means, use the chat to comment, but we will end by coming together to think about where we're going to for September. Thiago, have I forgotten anything?
Just that the transcription of the video will be shared with all the participants in the next few days. So you have the full text.
Thank you. Oh, and I changed search. So welcome to everyone. My name is Paul Heritage. I'm Director of People's Palace Projects at Queen Mary, University of London. We are hosting the third in a series of meetings about Indigenous research. So this is a program that brings together researchers from the United Kingdom with Indigenous researchers from around the world. So this conversation is going to be a chance, hopefully, for the two of you to talk together about what does Indigenous research mean. I'm going to give a very brief introduction to the two of you because you've never met except on this Zoom. And then I'll ask one question and then hopefully the conversation will flow. Ailton Kranaki, born in 1953 in the region of the valley of the Rio Doce. Simon, that's the valley of the Sweet River. It's the territory of the Kranaki people, an area that has been profoundly affected by mineral extraction. Ailton is one of Brazil's most famous environmental indigenous activists. He set up the Aliança dos Povos da Floresta, the Alliance of the People of the Forest, which very significantly brings together not just Indigenous people, but the people who live on the river banks, the non-Indigenous people. That's why it's an alliance. One of the most prominent leaders since the political awakening, as it's called, of the Indigenous peoples in Brazil from the 1970s onwards. He contributed to the creation of the United Nations of Indigenous Peoples. He has a vast intellectual, educational, and political output as a journalist, a commentator, a writer, as well as prolific and constant presence on radio, video, and television. He fought for the inclusion of what is called the Capítulo dos Índios, the chapter of Indigenous peoples, which is enshrined in Brazil's 1988 constitution, and which is supposed to protect Indigenous rights, cultures, and territories. He is co-author of the UNESCO proposal, which created the Reserva da Biosfera da Serra do Espinhaço in 2005, and is still a member of its management committee today. And in 2016, under a very different Brazilian government, he was given the Order of Cultural Merit. Ailton, it is an incredible pleasure to have you with us here and an honor to join this conversation. I want to put you in touch with someone that I admire and love very much, the theatre maker Simon McBurney. Simon was born a few years after you in 1957 in a town called Cambridge in England. He is the son of an English, Scottish, Irish secretary and a North American archaeologist. And perhaps some of these cultural roots might come up in conversation. He trained for theatre in Paris with Jacques Lecoq and went on to found and be the artistic director of Complicité Theatre, which is UK-based but globally loved. In addition to 3 decades of creating and performing Complicité's award-winning productions around the world, Simon is a much in-demand theatre and opera director from the National Theatre and English National Opera in London to Berlin, Moscow, Los Angeles, and Avignon, where he was the associate artist in 2012 for the festival. He is really familiar to us, Ailton, on television, in dramas, in comedies, as well as a familiar voice and presence in films that range from The Last King of Scotland through Harry Potter to Mission Impossible. In 2015, Ailton, and this is one of the reasons why we are having this conversation, he opened a play called The Encounter at the Edinburgh International Festival, which was a solo performance which he created and directed based on the story of Lauren McIntyre, a National Geographic photographer who found himself lost among the people of the Maiaruna in the Javari Valley in Brazil. Simon's play, his theatre event, was inspired by the novel Amazon Beaming by Petru Popescu. The encounter traces the journey of McIntyre into the Amazon rainforest, but on stage it incorporates this innovative technology to build a shifting world of sound. After playing in Edinburgh and London, the play toured around the world for over 3 years, was twice seen on Broadway, and this year its virtual performance formed part of Sao Paulo's International Festival of Theatre. I can hardly think of two people that I really most want to have a conversation. So I hope that I can just start with a question to Simon from something that Ailton wrote, and then let's see where we go. So Simon, Ailton gave us this wonderful quotation in something he wrote recently. Tradition is talking with the sky. It is talking to the earth. You aren't something outside the universe. You aren't something outside nature, protecting nature. You are the forest.
So first of all, when I think about this, I think about myself as a very small child and how I felt always instinctively at home when I was actually outside of my home. As a child, frequently, I lived under canvas in tents because my father was an archaeologist, and so he would go excavating different places around the United Kingdom, trying to contact and understand the earliest peoples who lived on this extraordinary planet of ours, on this earth. So I would be, as a child, I remember now, at this time of year, we would sometimes be in very cold, windy, brutal, rainy conditions, listening to the wind, listening to the sea, on the edge of the sea. And there on the edge of the sea would be a cave, and then we would dig in it. And I have a very, very powerful memory of digging the earth away, exposing the tusk of a now extinct mammoth coming out of the earth, and realizing, of course, as a child, that this had been killed approximately 120,000 years ago, and that I was the first person to look at this for 120,000 years. So there were two things here for me in which I felt a connection. The first was I felt a connection with living in the tent, with the wind and the rain and the seas. And the second connection I felt was over time with a deep past. I did not intellectualize these connections. I simply felt them in my body. And since then, it has been a place in my mind that I return to, a place in my body that I return to whenever, in a sense, I feel lost. I realize now at my age that from an early age, I didn't feel at home anywhere. And so one of the reasons, in a sense, that I became, I had no special community, if you like. I had no village. I was born in a town, but I felt that we came from all over the place, and I did not know where my land was. So one of the things for me that happened very quickly in the theatre was that I felt when performing that I was part of a community, that that community could be created through the process of performing. But when I was performing, I didn't feel that it was only me who was making this space, if you like. It was made by the imaginations of the audience, and they were as much creators of what we were doing as me, the person standing on stage with my other actors. And this sense of community, I remember my father saying to me, was also generated by the fact that when you play, the size of audience that you have is the same as the earliest human communities. So anywhere between 100 to 5,000 people, that is our natural community. And so one of the reasons why gathering together has a very profound place still within our culture is because I would say that for the majority of Western people, there is and has been gradually increasing over the last 500 years, a sense of what I would call homelessness, a sense of alienation, a sense of disconnection. And this disconnection has had many effects. One of the elements of the disconnection is the fact that we have felt almost disconnected from our natural feelings, and we are disconnected from a sense of empathy, which has allowed the development of the colonial mentality, that we can take something from other people, that the land is something to be exploited, that people are something to be exploited, that women are something to be exploited, that the working class are people to be exploited. And this sense of disconnection has led us into a terrible trap to where we are now. I feel profoundly that it's a moment where we need to listen outside of our culture, that's so-called Western culture, to hear, to amplify and to hear other voices, because very simply, in so many ways, in being homeless, we are lost, and we need to hear the voices to reorientate ourselves if we are to all of us survive. I have read a little of what you've written, and I relate to it very deeply. And I'm also very grateful for the absolute clarity of what you say, because it is something that we all need to hear, but in hearing it, we need to feel it in our bodies. We do feel it because we are in a place of crisis, but now it is up to us as well to act upon that hearing and feeling and change the course of how we are living. That is how I feel when I listen to what you have to say. It begins, my first feeling in terms of what you say is a profound sense of gratitude. Looking at the power of your words, the power of your actions, I am quite in awe of the strength that you have to continue, and the strength and the clarity that you have to be able to say the things that you say. And so my first question is, from where do you draw your strength?
Eu não tiro essa força de nenhum lugar. Eu sou apenas como desses pequenos grãos, uma semente que contém árvores e florestas dentro dela. E eu me disponho a esse fluxo da vida e a vida passa em mim e eu acho maravilhoso. Eu não tenho um trauma de ter experimentado a vida inteira a violência, porque a violência não é minha. A violência não é minha. Eu experimento a vida e o fluxo da vida. É uma experiência radical de estar vivo. E a morte não é meu assunto. Eu estou vivo. Sempre foi assim. Forever. Life, 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 forever. Violência não vale nada. É o resultado do nosso divórcio da fonte da vida. Gaia é vida. Mother Earth, a Mãe Terra, Gaia, Pachamama, é vida. Abundância, vida, prosperidade, vida. E isso é muito bom, é muito grande. E é disso que eu me nutro para cada dia estar como os pássaros. Os pássaros estão cantando ao meu redor aqui, eu estou ouvindo. E os outros animais também. Eu saí um pouquinho aqui porque eu fui pedir para os cachorros diminuir um pouco o coral deles, que eles estavam fazendo uma orquestra de cachorros aqui do lado. Eu pedi para eles maneirar. Mas tudo ao nosso redor grita. A vida grita. A vida é maravilhosa. E quando nós sofremos alguma violência, a gente se esquece da beleza da vida e podemos ficar duros, podemos ficar surdos ao canto dos pássaros, ao grunhir de todos os outros bichos e animais que estão vivos, lembrando para a gente que a Terra é viva, a Terra é viva. E se nós somos filhos da Terra, a gente pode experimentar esse mesmo fluxo, essa mesma intensidade de estar vivo. Eu queria saber do Simon, quando ele atravessa o oceano para vir para cá, para o continente americano, se ele deixa a Europa para trás ou se ele traz ela no bolso.
Of course, I am the sum of my past. And my past includes all the words that I learnt from my parents and my background and the schools that I went to and everybody who ever educated me and the books that I read and all the literature. But quite early on, I discovered that I was at home with people that I did not know. Now, that is the case when you are performing. You need to empty yourself in order to allow the place where you are to come through. If you are not present when you are performing, then if the past is too present or the future is involving you too much, then you can't perform because it is happening now in this moment. So very quickly, I discovered from quite a young age that I often felt at home when I was not, in theory, at home. I had experiences where I felt more at home in places that I had never been to before. I will have to give you an example. When I was 18, I left home for a year and I traveled by myself all over North America. And then I traveled all over the United States. And by a set of very strange chances, I fell into a group of people who had to go to Banks Island, about 400 miles from the North Pole. It's a very big island. The community to the north of where we are were the Inuit community in a village called Sax Harbor. They came down in their boats and they were hunting caribou. And then in the second wave of hunters coming down were young men of my age. And they immediately took me and they said, we have heard that there is a really good trout lake out here. I said, yes, this is our only source of good fresh fish. They said, well, come and show us where this trout lake is. So I went off with them across the tundra and I showed them the lake, and quite quickly we caught these very large trout. And the moment we caught them, they took hold of the trout and they put their thumbs in the eyes and they whipped out the eyes and gave them to me like little sweets, made me pop them in my mouth. Of course, much later I understood that in the eye there is a very high concentration of vitamin D. And then we started to track and hunt caribou. I tell you this story only because during that night, while I was with them, I felt very close. We were all the same age. We were young men. We were tracking caribou. I suddenly felt at home in a very profound way. I felt entirely present, and I felt in a way more at home than I had ever felt in my life. I felt that I was utterly part of this land, part of these animals, that I was doing something which had existed for thousands and thousands of years without thinking about it intellectually. I just felt, the only way I can describe it is to say, yes, I felt at home. It was a rare experience. It was not something that many people get to feel. And I felt that I was able to, through them, touch something which made me rooted. It rooted me into the earth. I can also feel that same thing when I am in Europe, but in general, when I am amongst people who are for a long time in the places that they have been. So in very remote rural communities, for example. I've never felt any relationship with only my language. I love other languages. I apologize, I don't speak Portuguese. But for me, just to have the taste of other languages in my mouth makes me realize that language is something which is passing through us all the time and is only a means by which we can reach out, and it is the space between you and I. So in answer to your, that's a very long answer. Of course, I carry myself with me. There are many beautiful poets. There are many beautiful musicians. There are many beautiful singers and lovers of the earth. There are many beautiful, extraordinary things that have come out of this place that we call Europe. But also we have become deaf to certain ideas, and we have become able to hear only certain other things. We have started to separate and fragment and try and understand the world as a set of pieces rather than as a single, as you call it, flowing unity.
Essa viagem que o Simon nos proporcionou, essa viagem pelas culturas, pelas memórias, a evocação da memória e também da ancestralidade. É maravilhoso, que bom que a pergunta sobre o que carregamos no bolso tenha revelado tanta beleza e tanta potência de afetos. eu estava exatamente procurando por isso, procurando por afetos. Como a nossa circulação pelo mundo pode produzir afetos, assim como as sementes que carregam florestas em si, as pessoas também podem carregar mundos, mundos plurais, que no contato uns com os outros semeiam essa pluralidade de mundos que produzem uma cosmovisão. Eu tenho despertado o meu interesse numa plurivisão, onde as culturas elas deixam de ser uma marca distintiva e passam a ser uma produção de eventos que se reconhecem criativos o suficiente para a identidade deixar de ser uma obsessão. Eu não estou interessado numa identidade obsessiva. As identidades elas têm que se diluir em favor de uma cosmovisão compartilhada, que nós somos todos filhos da Terra. As fronteiras que existem entre os nossos países, continentes, elas servem para o nosso atraso, não para a nossa evolução. Eu estou interessado na nossa evolução, mas o mundo precisa desmanchar as fronteiras. Essa experiência que nós estamos vivendo agora, globalmente, do clima, está nos castigando a todos igualmente, é uma maneira muito sábia da nossa Mãe Terra mostrar aos humanos que eles precisam melhorar a sua performance de humanos, que eles estão muito pesados. E eu não tenho dúvida, a pandemia é um evento, para além de um evento sanitário, ele é também um evento cosmológico, digamos assim. É uma cosmologia. Esse planeta, o planeta Terra, maravilhoso, fazendo a sua dança e dando um aperto no Homo sapiens, que está se tornando um sujeito insustentável. Então, esse Homo sapiens, ele está para lá de... Ele está produzindo doença dentro do corpo do planeta. Eu sou um ativo filho da Terra. Se a Terra está sendo afetada de uma maneira tão grotesca pela escolha dos humanos, ou a Terra podia muito bem os humanos e deixar os outros seres vivos que são mais gentis, como os ursos polares, como aquelas renas que vocês foram caçar. Então, assim, outros seres muito mais gentis na Terra do que os humanos. Definitivamente, são muito cheios de si. Eu, na verdade, estou cada vez mais desconfiado de que os humanos, a despeito de toda a sua inteligência, eles, na verdade, só pensam em si mesmos. O Davi Copenau Yanomami, esse nosso querido xamã Yanomami, ele diz que os homens sonham consigo mesmo. Os homens só sabem sonhar consigo mesmo. Eles precisam aprender a sonhar com as árvores, sonhar com as abelhas, sonhar com outros seres não humanos. Cerca de 8, 10 mil anos que os humanos sonham consigo mesmo. Eles podiam sair desse pesadelo e experimentar a dança cósmica com os outros seres que habitam o planeta Terra, junto com os humanos. E isso é um encontro poético, porque ele invoca perspectiva de uma pessoa que nasceu e viveu num lado do oceano, nisso que nós nos acostumamos a identificar como a Europa, uma perspectiva sobre a civilização que nos provoca a considerar ela cêntrica, porque ela tem uma dinâmica muito exclusiva e ela tem um movimento para dentro de si mesmo e pouca reflexão para fora. Como autor de alguns textos, eu procuro provocar essas faíscas para ver se a gente desperta também afetos. Porque a cabeça, o intelecto, parece que é o principal órgão desse corpo dos humanos autocentrados, quando deveria, na verdade, despertar para o coração.
I want to put something that to you both that Takuman always says, Takuman Kwikuru. When we describe him as a filmmaker or whatever, he will always say, I'm a researcher. First and foremost, I research. Do you both see yourselves as researchers?
You know, one of the curious things about the word search itself is that it comes from, this is a very odd thing about searching, and sometimes I feel like I am a searcher, but the origin of the word search comes from the same origin as circle, so that you can spend your life searching for something and arrive back at the same point that you started. Whenever I make, I have to give you an example. All I can do is give you concrete examples. So I make theatre. And normally you make a piece of theatre and then it's finished and then you go and make something else. But it doesn't work like that for me, because I make something and then I want to make it again and make it again and make it again and find something different, so that just as I feel Ailton talks about life, that everything is like a seed, everything is within the single thing. So whatever bit of life there is, everything is there within each tiny moment, the infinite is within the very, very small. So that when I'm making a piece of theatre, in a sense, I don't see the point of making another one, because the one you're making has everything within it already, in a way. And so if you ask me if I am a researcher, yes, but I am also aware that in searching, yes, I'm constantly searching, I'm restless, I'm looking, I want to understand. I'm also aware that in my constant search or research, I am traveling in a circle. That is the origin of the word. And you know, when I think about my father, who was researching the origins of humankind, his desire was to find out what makes us who we are, and that is a circle. One of the things that he discovered in northern Libya, when he found this huge cave called the Hawafatia, and he discovered it when he was in fighting in the Second World War. He discovered it. It's not his discovery, but he came across it. And then he dug down, and he found, by digging down, that this shelter had been occupied for continuously, without cease, for more than 120,000 years. And he discovered, when he dug this long pit down at around about 40,000, the level, the earth at about 40,000 years ago, he came up with a bone, and in it was a hole and another half hole. It was broken. And they didn't know what this was. They realized it was shaped in some way or another, until some time later, they suddenly realized that it was a fragment of a flute. And so all the way back all this time, we have also been musicians. And so we have also been storytellers. We have also been makers of ritual and theatre. And these things have joined us to where we are. The fact that the flute was made of a bone joined the player of the flute to the animal. The animal then, in a sense, became music. The theatre would have happened around a fire. The fire would have cast shadows, and the shadows themselves would have been alive. So all of this is, all my searching or my research is always arrives in the same place, which is to say that we are all connected.
Eu estava lembrando o Tacumã, que nos deu de presente essa afirmação de ser um pesquisador, e ele gosta desse constante contato com o mundo externo, observando, captando coisas daqui, de imagens, entrevistas. Nesse mundo do audiovisual, ele é um criador, um pesquisador, pode ser também ser um caçador. Ele é de um povo, de uma cultura de caçadores, coletores. E enquanto eu ouvia o Simon falar do período em que o pai dele esteve nessa caverna, habitada há séculos, há milhares de anos, por culturas que se sucederam, eu liguei os caçadores com essa experiência antiga dos humanos, né? Talvez um longo período da nossa existência tenha sido mesmo como caçadores, como coletores. E só muito depois que a gente aprendeu a ficar parado no mesmo lugar, sedentário. E a história dos caçadores é sempre apaixonante. Independente do lugar em que eles viveram, se foi há 4.000 anos atrás, eles tiveram, de certa maneira, um desenvolvimento da sua subjetividade, da sua poética, em que a música, os ritos, as danças, os cantos, sempre se constituíram num alimento para que essa humanidade pudesse existir há 40 anos, há tanto tempo. A celebração é essa maravilha que dá o sentido para que a gente não seja apenas caçadores, no sentido predadores, mas que somos também criadores. Criamos. Enquanto andamos, criamos canções, memórias. Me interessa muito mais a subjetividade, a poética, isso que eu invoquei como a criação, a produção de afetos entre os povos do planeta, entre os seres não humanos, entre nós, a onça, o veado, o macaco e todos os outros seres, a baleia, e que eu já evoquei aqui, aquele urso polar, que nós estamos esquecendo ele enquanto ele derrete junto com o gelo. Então, nós precisamos produzir afetos, para além de nos tornar capazes do a nossa própria subsistência, né, o nosso próprio alimento. Produzir junto com os alimentos também afeto. Nesse tempo em que o mundo está carente, se nós pudermos alimentar o mundo com poesia, com cantos, com danças, com celebrações, ritualizar a vida, nós vamos estar animando a uma outra visão de mundo, ou de muitos mundos, onde possa caber também o pé de abacate, a onça, o macaco e os humanos. Uma canoa que possa caber todo mundo. A ideia da Terra como uma canoa, ela é sempre alento, evoca uma poesia tão sensível, a canoa. Você deve ter andado de canoa quando você foi lá no Xingu ou lá no Javari. A canoa, ela exige da gente um cuidado de se instalar dentro da canoa. Principalmente aquelas canoas pequenas, né? A ubá, aquela canoa feita de uma peça de madeira só. A gente tem que se sentar quietinho no eixo daquela canoa, para que ela possa surfar sobre as águas e a gente experimentar isso como um brinquedo, uma satisfação, um contentamento. A gente precisa se assentar num espaço bem equilibrado, viver e fluir, e cantar, dançar, celebrar. Eu imagino a vida na Terra como uma celebração. Ela não precisava ser outra coisa. A gente podia ter ficado lá 40 mil anos atrás tocando flauta. A gente não precisa fazer nada novo, tudo é novo. A cada manhã a vida é uma novidade tão extravagante que a gente não precisava inventar mais nada, é maravilhoso.
To finish there, unfortunately, but Simon, I'm sure that you will be meeting again in better circumstances.
Marvelous to hear you. Really, muito obrigado.
Maravilha. Bom dia.
Bom dia.
Thank you for listening and for being with us for that conversation. I'm sorry that it was done in such strange circumstances, but I hope you realize why we wanted to share something of what happened, because it's a different format for us being together and thinking. And I'd like to say a really big thank you to Thiago for a really quick edit, translate, and putting in the captions. So we have, not very long really, just about 10 minutes, just reflections from people, things that you really want us to concentrate on, to focus on, to think about. People who want to join us for the conversations, please just say, because we want to do this as collaboratively as we've tried to do for the whole part of this process. Any thoughts or things you want to share at this stage?
Since we have been so challenged with not having as much contact with our Indigenous people or partners, if things, fingers crossed, allow for some hybrid activities where they could actually join us, because that I think would be such a fantastic experience for more of them to be with us than just us as the persons on the call.
That's a really, really good point, Violet. And I'm part of conversations in other groups where people are thinking about, is it possible to do more local things, but that are connected in different ways?
Yes, yes.
And so that's a great thought. And let's try and make that a bit of a guiding principle to how we go forward. So thank you, and that's really good. And perhaps we can come back to you, Thiago. I'll note that down, and we'll come back and we'll have a chat about that specific point, because that's a really good one.
I like the idea of doing local things as well, and probably streaming it. So probably we're going to have a series of local activities that all of us probably get a day, where our case study, with our partners can be streamed for the whole network, and people can maybe tune on to it in their own time. But we all, have pockets of things happening that can be shared collaboratively with the group.
Brilliant. I think it may be more like that. I think by September 21, we may change that date. I've just seen the comment. By September 2021, nobody may ever want to do Zoom ever again in their lives. So we've got to be a bit more imaginative. We have other ways of talking to each other. We can be, we did a bit of an experiment with Simon and Hilton. It worked, it didn't work. We just keep trying again. So let's be inventive. I really like what you're saying there, Violet, and I'm sure there's a lot of support from that. I see a few hearts coming up and some ticks there. So yeah, let's think about that. Lou, did you want to say something? I noticed that you'd switched on your camera.
There is a question from Luca Forcucci. asking about what are your strategies for future field work, considering the sanitary situations within Indigenous communities. Any thoughts?
Would anyone like to talk to that? I will say something I should have said at the beginning, because some of you have either at the May seminar or the one the year before have met Takumau. And so the Kwikuru, the first event was very much organized with them. They were part of four funded projects by the UKRI over the years. So they're very much co-hosts. They're a community of 800 people. And during COVID, as a result of the academic networks that's been established, not only through UK academics, but with American academics and with activists in Brazil, particularly with a very important activist NGO, we were able to ensure that the Kwikuru didn't suffer any fatalities. Where there was infection, we were able to provide medical team there that was there for 6 months in the Shingu with them, 8 months, and I think they're still there. They built their own isolation huts. So there are some great stories, I think, from Indigenous communities about how the interconnection with research has been a positive force when it came to a crisis moment. How that gets translated going forward, I think is really great to hear from other people about that. And that might be something that goes into our next meeting agenda, because it will radically change, certainly our work in the Shingu. We're going to have to be thinking, and perhaps we should be thinking in different ways going forward, resetting these agendas. So perhaps that's something very much for the September meeting. Does it have to be September? I don't know how to answer that, because it's related to, in terms of the specific funding, I don't know why I'm smiling. I could be cutting my wrists actually, but it's related to a grant that's technically under threat because it got folded into another grant. Now, don't worry, James, I think we are okay. But it therefore was technically related to a date of 2nd of September. As everything seems to have gone out the window in terms of commitments to dates and contracts and everything, I suspect we may have more leeway than we did have about when we do it. I think doing it by the 2nd of September was always a bit of a stretch anyway, because it's an odd date. So we'll listen to you. Give us some ideas if it's better to do it in term time or whatever a semester now looks like. We'll do it then. If we think it's better to do it before. So we'll do a bit of Thiago and Pedro will be talking to people about when's the best date. I think it will be around that time, between August and October. I can see somebody maybe thinking, why don't we do it in 2022 when we could definitely meet? I think that is stretching it too far for the funding councils. We do have to spend out that bit of money that we have to organise the final event. And we are very far from any end of the pandemics. And it's really important, I agree, to see it as a plural. We all have very different experiences of what the pandemic is, and we are going in different directions in different parts of the world, obviously. Anything?
Can I?
Kimaren, just to say goodbye to Kimaren, thank you so much for being with us, and we're really looking forward to your think piece, your piece you're writing for us. Yeah? Charlotte, was that Charlotte coming in? Or?
Sorry, it was. Yeah, it was just to add about the question about September, because in a way, some of our infrastructural problems and the issue of kind of no-cost extensions and then another no-cost extension and all the labour that's involved in that as well, it's very challenging for us to manage. But at the same time, the kind of short-termism of having to keep up with the deadline for the sake of keeping up with the deadline when we obviously need to have a really rich discussion around this. And I do worry about the consequences of the move to digital in relation to pandemic and what that will mean for funding. We've obviously already seen in relation to the development initiatives what that has meant, which is pretty devastating. But if we give enough reason for us not to use the money and we can find inventive ways to do it in other ways, then I think we might be sacrificing quite a lot of the face-to-face elements, which are so important for us to keep up our relationships of trust and reciprocity. And Kimaren actually said, you know, things often come in at the tail end. of the process. And I think our adaptability to be able to pay people, uphold our end of the bargains is just so key at this time, and really difficult to manage for all of us. So that was just I was just wondering in terms of how we
good points. Really good points. I think the thing about the shift to digital, that feels like a bit of a headline for us to take forward. And certainly I think there's been quite a bit of work that UKRA has sponsored on how the shift to digital has affected all different sorts of areas of our lives at the moment. And I'm not sure that we've taken it on board in relation to the Indigenous research methods or whatever in that way. So that's a great thing to take forward. And I think your point in relation to Violet's point, about how we can keep it local and how we can share work and increase the conversations, and getting that timing right is going to be important. So let's hope we've got a bit of flexibility on that still to be thinking. I mean, I was just thinking, well, perhaps we should move it all much earlier, but probably that would be a bigger mistake. I think we do need to give ourselves the space for it. And also to allow the writers who are producing. I think that's for me, one of the great things about this cycle of events and meetings. It's been productive. We produce, and it is a cycle. Research is a circle, as Simon says in the interview. And the idea that we've got these 12 case studies, we've got these videos, we've got these think pieces, we've got these, we still haven't exhausted our discussion around those, but we do, your point, Charlotte, there is a sort of, in the end of all those, there is something perhaps that's really rich for us to be digging around into thinking about and producing with. So let's give ourselves the space for that. Even though it's not an end, I mean, it's hopefully a beginning of something else. And that's why the timing is also important. Is there anything else anyone wants to share at this point? And as I've said in others, People's Palace projects, we're not anthropologists, we're not Indigenous experts. We make theatre and we share exchanges between artists. So please join us when we send you emails saying, have you got any ideas for the next events? We really mean it. We're hosts. We've been very privileged, and I'm really grateful to Ian and James and other people from UKRI who've supported us in doing this, but it is something just to create a space for all the incredible research that's being done in this field to think and share. So let's hope that can continue.
Yeah. I have one question, Paul, from earlier in the seminar, which relates to the technology shifts, the pandemic fallout, and I guess everything that has been discussed. It was from Rosalind Edwards. And I think she was picking up on Caroline's intervention about the idea of small, innovative co-production projects. So, and her question was if anyone has any suggestions in that line, thinking about the budget cuts as well, and how to make, small-scale co-production projects in this scenario.
It's a really good question. Is Caroline here? Does Caroline want to answer it, or somebody else?
Yeah, thank you. I'm still here. Yes, I don't think it's one I can answer necessarily. I just thought it's, we have this space now. We have this, these significant changes and shocks in terms of the wider funding landscape. And I know the representatives of funding bodies here cannot give us any more detail about how that might play out at the moment. But I was wondering if we could use this to find some of these small spaces of innovation. I mean, I don't have a picture in my head of what that would look like. It's more kind of the start of a conversation. But I do think we could, try and find something kind of productive from this very challenging moment, and think, can we try and find some of those small spaces to really take forward some of the ideas that we've been debating in this group?
Wonderful, inspiring thing to be saying, Caroline, at this moment. And I think it feels to me that it combines with what Charlotte and Violet were saying, and that perhaps when we think about the next event, we think in those ways about producing those local innovations and carry on being productive, even with the small amounts of money that we've got at this stage. So thank you, really thank you. So I think we've reached the end of this particular moment. I can see lots of comments on the chat, and I know that we're going to be preserving, archiving, sharing that. I want to thank everyone from right the way through from Claudia's ritual right the way through to now, because these have been grim days for us all, I think. And it's this sort of event actually just to remind ourselves for three hours, whatever it's been, of why we do it. So that's what I'm taking away from this. And thank you so much, everyone. And particularly thank you to the PPP, People's Palace Project's organising team, to Tiago and Pedro, for putting this all together. Okay, so without further ado, and there is no ritual, it seems, to end a Zoom that anyone has really come out with yet. We should have done a closing ritual, of course, shouldn't we? But thank you very much, everyone. And we'll certainly be in touch with everyone. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.